guys, today I'm just gonna be painting over one of my old sketches again, and I'm doing this just so I can get away from all of my other paintings. I'm just working on a lot of big things, and so I'm just gonna take this time to take a break from all of that by painting over this old sketch. And you might recognize this from one of my other videos. I will be leaving the link to this sketch video on the description for this one. I'm also going to be doing another more detailed tutorial for doing portrait paintings with gouache, but that's gonna take me a lot of time to fully do so I don't miss anything. So that's what's gonna have to wait until after I've uploaded my oil painting, I think. So back to this one, I am using a mix of my smallest brushes, and I'm also still using my number 3 brush from the Artist's Loft one. That it's a very old set that I have, and even though it's old and fraying, I still haven't found a good one to replace it, so that's why I'm using it still right now. I don't actually seal my line works when I do this, even though none of these inks that I'm using are waterproof at all. I think part of the reason why I'm confident that they won't bleed is because I'm not planning on using a lot of water this time. And also this is very old, so I'm not worried about the ink still being wet at all. And another big reason why I don't seal my paintings is because I don't have a sealing spray thing. But I have heard that hairspray works for that, so you might be able to use that one too. I just don't have hairspray on me right now. As usual, I am using my Holbein gouache. Actually, a few days before this, 2 big tubes of the Holbein white just got here, and I actually ordered that because I don't know if you guys remember, but I told you I was buying a big tube of the white from the Talons, but I really didn't end up liking it, which is so sad because that was such a big tube. But the Talons one, every time it would dry up on me, I just didn't like the way it reactivated, because even as I was working on the painting, when I would go back to it, it would already be dry, and so it just dries really fast. It kind of reminds me of how fast acrylic paint dries. In reference, when I'm using my Holbein gouache, the paint that I squeezed out from the start will remain wet and workable for the remainder of the painting as long as it's not big. I think I took for granted how great the Holbeins were in that area, at least. I feel like I had this idea that as long as paints are labeled professional, that they would act the same way, but obviously that's not the case. I'm sure the Talents are great with other things, I just don't think that it's the right fit for me. But even my Mia gouache reactivates better than the Talents ones. It has a lot of issues with the color mixing, but on that end, the Mia gouache I think is better than the Talons gouache. But I also just tried their white ones, so I don't know if that's how all of their paints will react. But yeah. So you can see that I've only squeezed out 3 colors this time on my palette, and that's because I'm planning on using the very old dried up ones, because the Holbeins do reactivate so beautifully, and these ones have dried for at least a few weeks, I think. So you can really tell how confident I am in how these things will reactivate, is that I've left them there for weeks, but I know I'm still gonna be able to use them again. So I'm starting by using very natural colors. I think a big part of it is because the 3 colors that I did squeeze out that are fresh are very natural. So I'm using fresh burnt sienna, yellow, and white. So even though I did use cool colors for her eyeballs, it still felt like most of the colors in here are different shades of brown, which is, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but for now I just wasn't feeling it, and the point of this was to de-stress and get away from everything that was stressing me out, but that was still bothering me. So even though I'm still working on it right now, on the back of my head, I knew that I needed to do something with the color palette later on. But I really loved working with gouache so much after working with oil paints. It was so comforting for me to go back to a medium that dries really fast and also reactivates after it does dry. So actually, before I started working with gouache, when I was still watching gouache videos, I always wondered why people would want anything that reactivates after it dries. It just sounds so frustrating. But after a lot of my frustrations with oil painting, really just wanted to give gouache a big hug, because now I can do things like laying paint down in streaks and be able to blend it out later on, long after it has dried. So even though I did enjoy this process and it made me appreciate gouache so much more, it was around this time when I started getting really frustrated with the colors. So while I was doing the eyes, I just couldn't get over the fact that the colors looked too uniform. It felt like the eyes were brown, and then her nose was also brown, and even her lips, which is just a slightly more saturated version of brown. And I couldn't have fun with it because it bothered me so much. And I think it was the most by the fact that if I took a black and white filter over this painting, it would just be as interesting as it is right now. So I stepped away from it because the point of it was for me to have fun. It wasn't doing that, so I went and gave a good cry, which just sounds so dramatic. But before this, so just so you guys could relate to me maybe, 2 paintings failed on me. One I spilled water on, and the other one, just the line work wasn't working. So I really needed to just leave this one for a while and take a break. But when I came back, I knew exactly what was wrong with this one. I think the problem was I was basing it off of the reference photo too much. Then that's why the colors looked too natural maybe. And what I needed to do was I just needed to not look at the reference photo while I was painting and just really have fun with the colors that I choose. So the first thing that I needed to do was the eyes. Not only were the colors just wrong on that one, I just didn't like the proportions. So I went over it with some green mixed with white and maybe also some red too. And this process was so therapeutic and relieving that while I was doing this, I immediately know where I needed to go with this little piece. So the first thing I always need is to have a goal with my paintings, and for this one I didn't have that while I started, and that's why I didn't know where to go. I felt like I was lost. So this time I decided that for this one it was to use unnatural looking colors, but then set it back by not going overboard with the values and the saturation for it. So all of these colors will stay in the mid-range in values, so I'm not gonna be mixing them very dark, and I'm also not gonna be adding very bright highlights for them. After I decided that was when I really started to have fun with it. I was using colors that are far from the reference photo, but also just very fun. And I even added some green on some of the shadows for her face. So there isn't that big of a range in values for the shadows, but they are all different colors. So the cheeks, the shadows of her cheeks are more red, but right under her lips and the shadows for her eyes, they're actually closer to green. And I'm finally having more fun with this. I also decided to add some purples in there too, just because red and green are too drastically different from each other. I want something that will be different from both of them, but also I just made sure that it doesn't overpower anything, because I do want the colors to look warm. So even though I did use purple, I added more white to it, so it's not just too punchy and too saturated that it overpowers the color palette that I've laid out before adding the purples. So finally it feels like the colors are working out, and now I can just focus on this being a therapy for me, which is what it was meant to be from the start. So now when I'm using the smallest brush for the details, now is when I'm using very saturated colors. So you see a lot of bright greens to replace the darkest parts of the painting, and also some splashes of purple that is slightly more saturated than the ones I laid out before, and I put it on her hair just so the colors there aren't very similar. And I almost wanted to celebrate around this time, because even though this thing is just essentially still a tiny piece in my sketchbook, it feels like it really served its purpose, and it took me out of this giant stump that I had before I started on it, and it actually looks good. I think it looks good. So now I can go back to my bigger pieces with a lighter heart and with a reminder of why I loved painting so much. So that is it for this video. Thank you guys for watching and going over this journey with me. I hope it wasn't frustrating to see me paint over a lot of the things like her eyes after you guys see me paint them almost fully. And I also debated just cutting out a lot of the parts in the beginning where I painted her eyes, but I also wanted you guys to see why it was frustrating me so much, and hopefully you guys can also relate to how that one feels. But yeah, thank you for watching, and I will be seeing you again soon.